Helldivers 2 is an amazing game, and the popularity proves it. I've already played over 70 hours in the last 2 weeks, and it's safe to say I'm addicted. The story and gameplay combine into a perfect agglomeration of satirical comedy, arcadey mechanics, and fun PvE co-op gameplay with friends or randoms. It's always fun to play with friends against a common enemy in an environment that facilitates fun. I also love calling in support that can blow the enemy to pieces, or use support weapons to mow down hordes of bugs. But what makes the launch of this game so special compared to other games, especially to me? Well, to answer this we have to step back and look at the release of games in the past few years. Too many games are launching in an unfinished state, with core mechanics either completely missing or changing so drastically through updates that it becomes a different game compared to when you first started playing. Don't get me wrong, I love indie games that are launched in early access and inevitably change over time in order to become the game the devs wanted. There's no problem to this, but I think it should be the exception, not the rule. In my experience so far, Helldivers 2 does not have these fundamental problems, and it has an actual foundation to build off. This of course doesn't mean that it's perfect. Instead, I'm merely saying that it has a solid core that doesn't need much work. The core gameplay loop is simple, but fun, especially with friends. Of course some people may find it boring, and to be fair it sounds boring on paper. Going to slightly different planets, playing the same mission types over and over, with the only differences being the setting of the planet and the things that actually spawn in the mission, but I don't see these as major problems. And I even think that they're going to be addressed over time, as the devs add even more options for planets and things that can spawn like mission types. It works, and it's fun to me. That's what matters. That tangent aside, it's fun to shoot bugs or bots with your friends while calling in airstrikes on each other. Fun is the name of the game, and this game is fun. I think co-op games like this are meant to be fun, and offer many different playstyles for the players to explore. Letting people jump into the game, blasting bugs with machine guns, laser rifles, or flamethrowers should be the soul of the game. Any weapon should be a viable choice, for the most part. But they aren't. Well, why is that? A little preface here. I'm going to be mostly discussing higher level difficulties, basically anything at level 6 or higher. This is where I've played most of my matches, and also where players have to play if they want to unlock everything in the game. The only way to get the super samples is to play on level 7 difficulty or higher. The argument that you should just play on lower difficulties, bro, is nonsense. I'm not a dev, but it looks intentional that the devs want the players to play on the higher difficulties for at least some period of time. Okay, with that out of the way, to answer the question of why a lot of stratagems aren't viable, we have to look at the enemies being faced, and how the stratagems go against them. To do this, I want to spend a little time looking at what people usually bring as their stratagems for higher difficulty missions. Firstly, the 500 kilogram bomb or the Eagle airstrike are the most common stratagem. They have a quick response time, meaning that a few seconds after throwing the stratagem down, the airstrike will be there. The other reason is that they have a good AoE, area of effect, and damage. Direct hits with either can kill anything in the game, so obviously, when a strike is quick and effective, it's good for clearing things out quickly and efficiently. So, there's a stratagem that can kill basically anything, and that has a fast call-in time. Why wouldn't you take it? An honorable mention here is the Eagle cluster bomb, but that only clears smaller enemies, and people usually only bring it if the rest of the team brings either the 500 or the Eagle airstrike. The second most common that I see is the orbital laser or the orbital rail cannon. These are pretty interchangeable, depending on team loadout and personal preference. The orbital laser can do a lot of focus damage over a short time. Although by itself it doesn't really kill the big targets, it can handle crowd control very well and do a lot of support damage to big enemies. Combine it with another stratagem or support weapon and it's excellent. The orbital laser can also close bug holes and destroy automaton factories. So if you have a large nester factory, they can be perfect for cleaning up. The downside of the laser is that you only get 3 uses per mission, and a high cooldown between those uses. Some people bring the orbital rail cannon as an alternative. It targets the strongest enemy closest to the stratagem, and sends down a high power charge of energy through said target. It obviously doesn't have the same level of crowd control the laser has, since it's only targeting a single enemy, but it can one-shot big enemies for the most part. The trade-offs are that it has a quicker cooldown and unlimited uses compared to the laser, but like I said, it only targets one enemy. So those stratagems are what people usually bring in their first 2 slots. The last 2 slots vary a little, but ultimately serve the same purpose. The 3rd slot usually carries a backpack or turret, depending on what the team brings and what support weapon you're bringing. The 2 most common backpacks I see are the personal shield generator and the laser version of the rover dog. The shield generator pack is the best option in my opinion, as it can protect you from annoying enemies such as stalkers, biospitters, chargers, rocket devastators, and any random laser shots when you fight the automatons. The only 2 turrets worth mentioning in this video are the autocannon, the best one in my opinion as it can kill all the heavy enemies, and the mortar sentry, which is a close second because it does good damage and it can be placed nearly anywhere. Unfortunately, the sentries are glass cannons and can't withstand enemy attacks. People usually only bring sentries for specific missions or scenarios. Ultimately, you're getting a lot more bang for your buck with backpacks. For support weapons, it usually comes down to 3, maybe 4 choices. That is the railgun, the best one and most common as it can kill nearly everything, especially when multiple are used against the single enemy. The grenade launcher, which is great for crowd control and closing bug holes. The autocannon, which is just a great all-rounder, and sometimes the recoilless rifle. It's slow without a partner, but deadly and very efficient. While you could technically not bring backpacks or support weapons, they are such a force multiplier for the single person that carries them. So, those stratagems are being used for a reason. They are good, and nearly everything else is just bad or too situational. For example, the barrages can be good, but the spread causes them to be unreliable and a risk compared to an airstrike. So, these stratagems must need a nerf, right? No, nothing should be nerfed in its current state. Instead, I think a lot of the equipment in the game needs a significant buff. Buffs can be done in many ways. What probably comes to mind first is the simplest thing, simply increasing the stats. I do think some of the stuff in the game needs their stats to be buffed like this, especially many of the unused support weapons. But I also think that there are some other options to still offer a quote-unquote buff without just increasing stats. The idea that I keep coming back to is splitting stratagem slots into offensive and defensive. Offensive stratagems are the things like the Eagle airstrike, orbital weapons, and basically anything that's going to be called in to blow something up. The defensive stratagems consist of the things like the support weapons, backpacks, turrets, anything that you can call in that's going to help you, but you either have to carry or like a sentry, it's just going to do its own thing and you have no control in it. So this system could be done in many ways. Perhaps by default, you get one offensive slot and one defensive slot at the beginning of the game. And using the current system in the game where you upgrade modules, you can buy more slots. If the devs didn't want to go down that road of upgrading to get more slots, they could just simply split it and keep a certain number of slots for each categories. Maybe you get 3 offensive slots, 2 defensive slots, or 3 slots of each, 4 slots of each, it doesn't matter, as long as it's actually split into the offensive and defensive. How would this buff stratagems? Well, it would allow players to bring the stratagems that are good, and, in the current state, viewed as a necessity to fight certain heavy enemies, and the ones that players like, but aren't always useful. The walking barrage is a very fun stratagem to use, and it's really not that bad, but in the current state of the game, is it worth using over any other stratagem listed in the previous section? Not really. That's what I want to fix. You could argue that this might make the game too easy, but you're thinking too narrow if this is your main concern. If we had more stratagems in the current state of the game, it might be slightly easier, sure, but there are many factors that could be changed in order to balance things out. Maybe slightly more enemies spawn, cooldown times are increased, use times are increased, etc, etc. Think of a current mechanic in the game, change it, and it might change the balance. Another system to consider is having a way to permanently have a stratagem brought on mission without taking up a slot. This again could be done in many different ways. More ways I could even talk about in this video. Firstly, there are many ways you could acquire this upgrade. And the upgrade system itself could vary. It could be a module upgrade, or you could maybe have to spend requisition points to upgrade specific stratagems. Maybe there's tiered upgrades. Maybe the first upgrade upgrades the stats, and then you can spend more requisition points to get that stratagem permanently. One example is that you could upgrade your hell pod to carry a support weapon, so you don't have to call it down using a stratagem. Maybe only certain stratagems can be used permanently without a slot. The orbital precision strike is a perfect example of this. It's a stratagem that can be very helpful because of the strong damage, but it has a small AoE and long-ish call-in time. I understand it's a beginner stratagem, but it could become super useful in the endgame just by letting players have it without it taking up a slot. It seems the devs are already somewhat testing this idea out by giving all players specific stratagems for a certain amount of time during their missions without it taking up a slot. But again, this whole system could vary heavily, and I don't want to get into too many specifics. Instead, just lay out some of the ideas that I thought of, and if the devs want to implement anything like this, then they should have to think it all out and ensure it's a fair but fun system. Trying to wrap things up, I want to circle back to my main point. The game should be fun. This is a PvE game where you're killing hundreds of bugs with your friends. I don't think people should be worrying about metas. Instead, the game should encourage players to choose a wide variety of stratagems and weapons. For example, I want to use a flamethrower and burn hordes of bugs, but I don't think the game currently incentivizes you to bring a flamethrower over other stratagems. I feel like I've barely scratched the surface with potential ideas to fix some of the problems in the game. I really just want the equipment in the game to become better and let you complete the missions how you want. The highest difficulties will of course always have a quote-unquote meta, but instead of trying to bring the meta equipment down, we should raise everything up. If you have any ideas to make spreading democracy more efficient or fun, please leave a comment. I'll see you fellow Helldivers planet side.